There is a room in Jerusalem that no one can precisely locate anymore. Its walls are gone. Its ceiling has collapsed through the centuries. The street on which it stood has been rebuilt so many times that the original stone lies buried beneath layers of empire, crusade, Ottoman mortar, and modern asphalt. And yet what happened inside that room on a Thursday night in the spring of the year 33 of our era altered the architecture of human civilization more completely than any battle, any treaty, any revolution in recorded history. Not because of what was decided there, not because of what was promised there, though promises were made that the universe has not yet finished keeping, but because of what was given there, because of what one man did with bread and wine and a towel and a basin of water in the last hours before they came to arrest him, and because the meaning of what he did has been expanding outward through time like light from a source that cannot be exhausted. Most people who know anything about this night know the broad outline. The Last Supper, Judas, the betrayal, the kiss in the garden. These are elements so embedded in the cultural memory of the Western world that they have become almost invisible through familiarity. The way a word repeated too many times loses its meaning and becomes merely sound. But the familiarity is a veneer. Beneath it lies something so structurally strange, so theologically precise, so historically dense that it rewards the most serious attention a human mind can bring to it. Because what happened in that upper room was not the tragic farewell dinner of a teacher who knew he was about to die. It was the deliberate, architecturally planned installation of something new at the precise moment when everything old was reaching its final hour. To understand the weight of what happened in that room, you must first understand the room itself within its city and its calendar. Jerusalem in the spring of the year 33 was not a quiet provincial backwater. It was one of the most volatile, densely populated, religiously charged cities in the entire Roman world. The Passover brought between 200,000 and 300,000 pilgrims into a city built for a fraction of that number, pilgrims who came carrying not just their luggage, but their longing, their national memory, their accumulated grief of 4 centuries of foreign domination, their desperate hope that this year, perhaps this year, God would act again the way he had acted in Egypt, that the occupying empire would be broken, that the promises spoken by the prophets would finally find their solid earth. The Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, understood this volatile chemistry well enough to relocate his administrative seat from his comfortable coastal residence in Caesarea Maritima to Jerusalem every Passover, bringing additional cohorts of soldiers with him, positioning them at strategic points around the city and in the Tower of Antonia overlooking the temple complex, ready to suppress any disturbance before it became an insurrection. The temple establishment, the high priestly families who governed the religious and, to a significant extent, the civil life of Jerusalem under Roman oversight, also understood the danger. They navigated the Passover season the way a physician navigates a crisis, with precision, with political calculation, and with a strong preference for maintaining the status quo that had kept them in power. Into this city, on the Sunday 5 days before his death, Jesus of Nazareth had entered on a donkey, while crowds spread cloaks and palm branches on the road and shouted words from the Psalms that carried unmistakable messianic resonance. In the days that followed, he had taught daily in the outer courts of the temple. He had engaged and silenced successive delegations of Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes who came to trap him in his words. He had pronounced a judgment on the temple that left his own disciples in stunned silence. And now the week had reached its final evening. The 14th of Nisan had arrived. The lambs had been slaughtered. The city was saturated with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of the Levitical choirs. Every family was gathering around their Passover table to do what Jewish families had done on this night for 14 centuries, to re-enter the story of the Exodus, to re-inhabit the experience of liberation, to become, once again, the people whom God had rescued from slavery with an outstretched arm and a mighty hand. Jesus had sent 2 of his disciples ahead earlier in the day to prepare the room. The instruction he gave them was cryptic to the point of being almost theatrical. Go into the city, follow a man carrying a water jar, and whatever house he enters, tell the owner that the teacher asks where the guest room is where he may eat the Passover with his disciples. A man carrying a water jar would have been conspicuous in first-century Jerusalem because carrying water was considered women's work. It was the kind of instruction that pointed to a prior arrangement, so careful and deliberate that even Judas, who was already planning the betrayal, could not know the location in advance until it was too late to alert the authorities before the meal was over. Every detail had been considered. Every step had been planned. The man who would be arrested that night was not carelessly walking into a trap. He was managing his own timeline with sovereign precision. The room they found was described as large and furnished, a guest room on the upper story of a house, the kind of space used for precisely this kind of gathering. The table would have been low, following the custom of reclining at Passover rather than sitting upright, a practice deliberately adopted to enact the posture of free people rather than slaves. Because on the night of the Exodus, the Israelites had eaten standing, in haste, with their staffs in their hands. But every subsequent Passover was celebrated reclining, because the liberation had been accomplished and the people were no longer in a hurry to flee. They were free to rest. The irony of that custom on this particular night was the kind of irony that only a divine playwright could have written into the script, because the man who reclined at that table was hours away from the moment that would make every previous concept of freedom look like a rehearsal for the real thing. 13 men gathered in that room, 12 disciples, most of them Galileans, men of trade and artisan backgrounds with the exception of Matthew, the former tax collector, and perhaps 1 or 2 others of more complex social histories. And their teacher, the rabbi from Nazareth, who had gathered them 3 years earlier on the shore of a lake and told them to follow him, who had led them through the villages of Galilee and the regions of Tyre and Sidon and the Decapolis and the Jordan Valley, and now, at the end, to this room in the city that he had wept over from the Mount of Olives just days before. They were men who had seen things that had permanently reconfigured their understanding of what was possible. They had watched the dead walk out of tombs. They had seen bread multiply in hands that should have been empty. They had watched their teacher walk on water in a storm and stand in uncreated light on a mountain summit while the voice of God spoke over him from a cloud. They were not naive men, and they were not easily surprised. But what was about to happen in this room would reach depths that none of their accumulated experience had prepared them to receive. What we know about the sequence of the evening comes primarily from 4 sources: the three synoptic Gospels, and the Gospel of John, which offers a dramatically different angle of entry into the same events. Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us the institution of the supper, the bread, and the wine, the words of covenant. John, who is present reclining beside Jesus at the table, gives us something the others do not, the full discourse that followed. 5 chapters of it, the longest single recorded teaching in the New Testament, delivered in the hours before the arrest. But before the teaching and before the institution of the supper, John gives us something else, something that none of the other Gospels record, something that happened at the beginning of the evening that established, with an action more eloquent than any words, the entire logic of what was about to unfold. Jesus rose from the table, removed his outer garment, tied a towel around his waist, poured water into a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet. The significance of this act cannot be reduced to a lesson in humility, though it was that. It was something more architecturally precise. In the social world of first-century Judaism, foot washing was the task assigned to the lowest-ranking servant in a household. When guests arrived from the dusty roads of Palestine, their feet were washed. But the task was considered so degrading that Jewish legal texts of the period specified that Hebrew slaves were not obligated to wash their master's feet. This was the work of Gentile slaves or of disciples who chose voluntarily to honor their teacher by performing a service beneath the legal obligation of slavery. The disciples themselves had been arguing, as recently as the walk to Jerusalem, about which of them was the greatest. The question of rank and precedence was alive in the room, and the one person in the room whose rank was not in question, the one before whom every other person in that room owed not honor but worship, knelt on the floor with a basin and a towel. Peter's reaction was visceral and revealing. He refused, not because he was indifferent to what Jesus was doing, but because he understood it completely. "If you are who I believe you are," he was saying, "then this is wrong. The categories are reversed. The geometry of the universe is being violated." And Jesus answered him with words that open a door onto the entire theology of the Incarnation. "What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will understand afterward." And when Peter still refused, Jesus said something that collapsed all resistance. "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." It was not an offer. It was a structural statement. The washing was not optional, because the relationship was not optional. "You cannot be in fellowship with me," the sentence implies, "while refusing to receive my service." The one who insists on maintaining his dignity at the cost of accepting what I give is the one who loses everything he is trying to protect. That exchange contains, in compressed form, the entire scandal of the gospel. The God who made the world comes to serve it. The one before whom the seraphim veil their faces kneels in the dust of human feet. The one who will be betrayed by one of the men in this room washes that man's feet without exception. Because John tells us that Jesus knew who would betray him when he began washing. He knew, and he washed Judas anyway. There is a theology there that is larger than any commentary has fully contained. The grace that was about to be enacted on the cross was not grace that waited to assess the merit of its recipients. It was grace that washed the feet of its betrayer. When the supper itself was underway, when the Passover ritual had moved through its prescribed stages, Jesus took bread and did something the Passover liturgy had never included before. He broke it And he said, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then he took the cup, the third cup of the Passover ceremony, the cup of redemption, the cup specifically associated in the Passover liturgy with the promise of God to redeem his people from slavery. And he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you." To understand what those words meant in that room, you must understand what the word covenant meant in the ancient world, and particularly in the religious imagination of Israel. A covenant was not a contract. Contracts are transactional. You give this, I give that. The obligation is mutual and limited. A covenant was something categorically different. It was a relationship, a bond between parties of unequal power, sealed not with a signature, but with blood, ratified not by lawyers, but by sacrifice. The great covenants of the Hebrew Scriptures were events of world restructuring significance. The covenant with Noah bound God to the continued existence of creation. The covenant with Abraham bound God to a promise of descendants and land and blessing that would extend to all nations. The covenant with Moses at Sinai bound God to a people and a people to God through a law that would govern every dimension of their lives. The covenant with David bound the royal line to God's purposes in a promise that the prophets had described in terms of a king whose reign would have no end. Each of these covenants had been spoken of by the prophets as partial, preparatory, anticipatory. The prophet Jeremiah, writing in the 7th century before this night, had looked forward with an extraordinary specificity to something that had not yet arrived. "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." Jeremiah chapter 31. 7 centuries after Jeremiah wrote those words, in a room in Jerusalem on the 14th of Nisan, the man who had been present when Jeremiah wrote them took the third cup of a Passover meal and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." He was not improvising. He was not reaching for available metaphors. He was doing what the entire history of Israel had been moving toward since the first covenant was sealed with blood at the foot of Sinai. And he was doing it with a calm that was itself a kind of declaration, the calm of someone who is not surprised by what is unfolding, who is not a victim of circumstances, but the author of them. Then the discourse began. 5 chapters in John's Gospel, a sustained, architecturally coherent address that moves from intimacy to cosmology, from practical instruction to metaphysical depth, from present sorrow to eschatological promise, held together by a single underlying logic. I am going, but you are not being abandoned. Everything the world calls security is about to be removed from you. Everything that gave you confidence, my physical presence, my authority visible in real time, my ability to intervene directly in the next crisis, all of that is about to be withdrawn. And what will replace it will be greater, not lesser, greater. He told them he was going to prepare a place for them and that he would come back. He told them they already knew the way. Thomas said, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" And Jesus said, "I am the way, and the truth, and the life." This is not a metaphor softened by familiarity into decoration. In the mouth of the man who said it, in the context of a Passover meal in which the entire history of Israel's exodus and journey to the Promised Land was being deliberately invoked, this sentence had a structural specificity that the original hearers would have felt in their bones. The Torah had been called the way. Wisdom had been called the way. The path of righteousness, the direction of the commandments, the road through the wilderness toward the inheritance, all of that was called the way. And now the man sitting across the table from Thomas said, "I am not pointing you toward the way. I am not giving you a map of the way. I am the way. The road has become a person. The destination has become a presence. You do not travel toward him. You travel in him." Philip asked to see the Father, and Jesus answered with words that are still detonating through the centuries. "Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." The claim is so absolute that it admits no middle ground. Either it is the most audacious blasphemy ever uttered at a Passover table, or it is the most important truth ever spoken in a room. There is no comfortable position between those two options. The history of every serious encounter with Jesus of Nazareth has eventually been forced to inhabit that discomfort. He told them about the Counselor, the Spirit of Truth, the one who would come after him and would not only be with them as he had been, but would be in them. He told them that the Spirit would teach them all things and remind them of everything he had said. He told them that where 2 or 3 gathered in his name, his presence would be there. He was describing the architecture of something that had never existed before, not a religion in the conventional sense, not an institution sustained by hierarchy and ritual, but a living network of relationship between persons, and a person who, though physically absent, would be more present than physical presence could ever be. And then, in what is perhaps the most intimate moment recorded in all of human literature, he began to pray. Not about them, not for them in the abstract. He prayed them by name, not the names the text gives us, but the weight of the moment is clear enough. He carried them before the Father as individuals, known, loved, specific. He asked that they be protected. He asked that they be sanctified. He asked that they be unified, with the same kind of unity that existed between the Father and the Son. A unity not of organizational structure, but of shared life, shared love, shared nature. And then he extended the prayer beyond the 12. "I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word," which means he was praying for everyone who would hear the testimony of those 11 men. Which means he was praying in that room, on that night, for people in centuries he had not yet entered by any human calculation. He was praying for us. That is either the prayer of a man in the grip of grandiosity as he walked toward his death, or it is the prayer of the one for whom the boundary between past and future is a vantage point rather than a wall. If the second, then the upper room is not a room in first-century Jerusalem that has been lost under layers of archaeology. It is a room that is still, in some sense, that defies the logic of linear time, in session. The prayer is still in the air. The hymn they sang before going out, Matthew and Mark record it simply. They sang a hymn and went to the Mount of Olives, was almost certainly the second half of the Hallel, the psalms of praise sung at every Passover, the psalms that described the steadfast love of God, the deliverance from death, the stone rejected by the builders becoming the cornerstone, the gates of righteousness, that the righteous shall enter. They walked out of that room singing those words, knowing or not knowing in various degrees what waited in the garden at the bottom of the hill. And the one who walked at the center of them, the one who had washed their feet and broken the bread and prayed the prayer, was not walking toward defeat. He was walking toward the moment for which every Passover had been a rehearsal, toward the sacrifice that would make every other sacrifice in human history simultaneously comprehensible and obsolete. The upper room is lost, the street is buried. But the covenant enacted there, the new covenant in blood, is still the governing reality of the lives of hundreds of millions of people across 2,000 years and every continent on earth. The towel and the basin and the broken bread and the cup of redemption are still the instruments through which one man described the nature of a God who serves, who washes, who gives, who pours himself out, not because he must, but because that is what love looks like when it has no limit and no end. The question that room poses has not aged. It is the same question it posed to Peter when the basin was placed before him. Will you receive what I am offering, or will you insist on the dignity of earning it yourself? One road leads to fellowship. The other leads to the preservation of a self that was never worth preserving at the cost of what was being given. The door of the upper room is still open. The towel is still in his hands. And the new covenant, sealed not with the blood of animals in the courts of a temple that no longer stands, but with the blood of the one who said, "This is my body, this is my blood," is still in effect, still the architecture of the only reality that does not eventually collapse under its own weight. If the history behind these hours has opened something in your understanding that you want to keep following, this channel exists for exactly that purpose: to walk into the texts and the archaeology and the historical world of the scriptures with the kind of seriousness they deserve. Subscribe if this kind of exploration matters to you. And if someone you know is standing at the door of these questions without knowing there is a room behind it, send them this. The door was built for everyone. The table has never been short of room.